The probate courtroom smelled like lemon polish and old money. My name is Camilla Reyes, 44, a Major General in the U.S. Air Force, living alone in a one-bedroom over a barbershop in Alexandria, running pre-dawn rucks by the Potomac, and visiting a memory care unit every Sunday. Across the aisle, the people who raised me took their seats like a firing line. They still call me the mistake, the unfeminine one, the ghost. I answer the way I learned downrange, by holding fire. On my keyring hangs a scratched challenge coin from a medic I couldn't save. In this room, words are weapons. Mine stay holstered until the evidence takes the shot. Before we go any further, I want to know, where in the world are you hearing this from? Share it in the comments, because even if our paths are different, pain and strength sound the same everywhere. The air in the courtroom was thick, a humid July afternoon in downtown Washington, D.C. The blinds were drawn, slicing the light into long, golden bars that highlighted the dust motes dancing in the air. I could see the sweat beading on the temple of my mother, Evelyn, as she leaned over to whisper to the family's lawyer. Her face, a mask of rehearsed grace, was a careful study in composure, but her grip on her silk clutch was white-knuckled. My sister, Sienna, sat beside her, a brittle charm radiating from her, a low-wattage hum that I was the only one who could truly hear. She was trying to look bored, a performative sigh as the judge's clerk droned on. I knew that hum. It was a warning. A low-frequency vibration just before a window pane cracks. I'd heard it my whole life. This wasn't a legal battle to them. This was a spectacle. A public performance of family honor, or what was left of it. They had positioned me as the outsider, the pariah who had abandoned my duty to the family. They saw my military career not as service, but as a hobby, an excuse to escape my real responsibilities. Their narrative, whispered for months through the halls of our social circles, was that I was attempting to dispute my grandfather's will, a document they claimed was clear and beyond reproach. The narrative was, of course, a lie. A convenient fiction that allowed them to paint me as the ungrateful, unhinged daughter, trying to pry a piece of the inheritance that was rightfully theirs. I was there for the truth, not the money. The will, in a final act of quiet justice, had left me as the sole trustee of the Maddox Vale Foundation, with an endowment for its operations and a clear directive to audit all accounts. To my family, this was an unforgivable insult. But they'd been so careful, so sure of their victory. They had already been granted a temporary receivership, citing my inability to perform due to my military schedule. It was a classic move, leveraging a half-truth to achieve a full deception. I looked over at my mother. Her lips were a thin line, the kind I knew meant she was mentally rehearsing a talking point. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, her expression turning from a practiced sneer to something colder, harder. It wasn't hate. It was a kind of righteous anger, a feeling that I was an obstacle to be overcome. This quiet confrontation, the stakes a legacy built over a century, felt like a silent test. The air conditioner hummed, a low, steady sound that I was acutely aware of, like the hum of a jet engine before takeoff. It was the backdrop to everything. The sound of inevitability. My fingers went to my keyring, finding the cool, worn edge of the challenge coin. I held it in my palm. Its ridges were almost smooth now, from years of friction. It felt like a small, private weight, a reminder of a promise. A silent, disciplined presence. On my way in, I'd passed the barber shop below my apartment. The smell of aftershave and hot towels still clung to my suit jacket, a comforting, familiar scent that felt entirely out of place here. It was a grounding anchor to my new reality, a quiet life I had built for myself, far from the polished, air-conditioned world of my upbringing. Here, in this room, I was still the girl who was always on the periphery, the one who wasn't quite part of the family portrait. My honor, my career, my life, all of it was being put on trial by a few casual words and a well-placed smirk. I had to let it happen. I had to let them think they were winning. My family, my own flesh and blood, had chosen to publicly misunderstand me for their own gain. They had taken my silence for weakness. They had taken my discipline for coldness. I heard the judge call my name. I took a slow, deep breath, centered myself. The humid air, the lemon polish, the hum of the air conditioning. Everything was in place. I was a weapon in a sheath, and I would not draw until the moment was right. But that wasn't the whole story. My entire life, the hum had always been there. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling. A low-grade vibration of being just out of sync with the world around me. Like standing in the wrong room, wearing the wrong clothes, speaking the wrong language. In my family, success was an art form, a public performance of grace and affluence. I was a science experiment gone wrong, disciplined, pragmatic, and entirely out of place. My mother, Evelyn, was a social tactician, her movements as precise as a clockmaker's. My sister, Sienna, had inherited my mother's flair for the dramatic, a talent she turned into a booming fashion brand. They lived in a world of curated moments, where every smile was rehearsed and every photo was framed for a specific audience. I remember one specific evening in our brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, the air crisp with the first hint of autumn. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the sharp tang of expensive perfume and the faint, sweet smell of the family's prize-winning roses in the garden. It was a donor's night for the Maddox Vale Foundation, and our home was filled with the kind of people who spoke in whispered tones and laughed with their heads thrown back. My mother had asked me to set up the projector, dear, in the library, a task I knew was a polite way of keeping me out of the main event. It was my money that had paid for the new water filtration project in rural Georgia, but it was my sister who was presenting the grant's impact. I stood in the corner, a ghost in my own home, watching as Sienna stood under the soft glow of a spotlight, her every gesture radiating a theatrical humility. The hum was so loud that night I could feel it in my bones. It was the sound of a truth being stretched so thin it was about to snap. That was the pattern. I was always the one doing the work while others took the credit. I was a silent partner, an anonymous contributor, an invisible force. While I was deployed, rising through the ranks, I would get calls from my mother asking for a temporary advance to cover a shortfall in the foundation's budget. I always sent the money, never questioning it. My deployments took me all over the globe, from the arid heat of Al Udeid to the quiet, dignified airbase at Ramstein. I was focused on my mission, on the lives under my command. I trusted them. It was a word I had learned to take at face value, a currency as valuable as my honor. They knew my schedule. They knew where I was. They knew I was a world away, with my attention laser-focused on my job. They had a physical distance from me, a different time zone. But they had a moral distance, too, one I wouldn't discover until later. There was a moment, a small, quiet one, that I kept coming back to. I was home on leave, and my mother was showing me the plans for a new wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that the foundation was funding. She was gesturing grandly at the architectural drawings, talking about legacy and impact. I noticed my name wasn't on the donor list. It was a minor detail, but it hit me like a physical blow. The name on the list was Contributor Anonymous. I knew it was me. But to them, I was just a source of funds. A tool, not a person. My mother's smile was a fortress I couldn't breach. She said, "Some things are more meaningful when they are done without fanfare, dear." I believed her. I wanted to. I had learned to accept their justifications for my marginalization. That was the frost. The beginning of a quiet cold that was slowly creeping into my life. It was a feeling of being frozen out, bit by bit, until my place in the family felt less like a seat at the table and more like a name on a waiting list. They knew what they were doing, and I was too preoccupied with a different kind of duty to see it. I had been training to detect threats in the field, not at home. I was so used to my world being black and white, right and wrong, that I had missed the shades of gray blooming in my own backyard. The small withdrawals from my accounts, the filings for temporary custodial POA, they all seemed like benign paperwork, a part of a bureaucracy I didn't have time to review. I trusted them to handle it. I trusted them with my name, with my reputation, with my entire life. I was wrong. I was so wrong. The hum had become a roar, and the crack had splintered the glass entirely. It happened at the Founders' Dinner, an annual country club event in Greenwich, Connecticut, held to celebrate the Maddox Vale Foundation's latest successes. The air was cool and salty from Long Island Sound, but the ballroom felt suffocatingly hot. The room hummed with the clinking of silverware on porcelain, a low murmur of self-congratulatory laughter, and the rustling of expensive silk. I was at a table by the window, positioned just out of the main social orbit, watching the scene unfold like a documentary. My sister, Sienna, took to the stage. She was wearing a dress of her own design, a cascade of emerald silk that seemed to glow under the soft light. She looked every bit the gracious, accomplished heir. The microphone screeched as she tapped it, a jarring noise that silenced the room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice a polished whisper. She spoke of the foundation's unprecedented growth, of the visionary leadership that had steered it to new heights. The hum was building. I could feel it in my teeth. This was the moment I had been dreading and waiting for. She pulled out a large, framed check. It was a donation to a new wing at a prominent children's hospital, a project I had worked on for years, even from halfway across the world. The sum was staggering, a public display of the family's largesse. But then she held up a different document, a simple, unassuming piece of paper. "And none of this would be possible," she said, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "without the tireless work of our dedicated team. While some choose to serve in uniform, others of us, the real builders, wear our hearts on our sleeves." My mother, Evelyn, smiled and nodded knowingly from the head table. The camera lights flashed. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, the slow-motion rush of adrenaline before impact. Sienna was not just taking credit, she was using my life as a prop for her own narrative. The phrase "parade uniforms" hung in the air like a taunt, a dagger disguised as a compliment. I felt my heart cadence accelerate, my pulse thrumming in my ears. The hum was so loud now it felt like a physical pressure against my skull. My fingers went cold, a physiological response to stress I knew all too well. Then she said it. The dagger, delivered with rehearsed grace. We had to make some difficult decisions to ensure the foundation's fiscal health. We had to cut out the distractions, the uncommitted parties. The room went silent. I was a grenade with the pin still in, and everyone was waiting for the explosion. They expected a reaction. A denial. A scene. But I had been trained for this. I knew how to hold fire. I had been taught that silence is a weapon, that discipline is a form of armor. I sat still, my expression unreadable. I watched them all watching me. My family, my so-called friends, the people who had toasted my grandfather 100 times. Not one person looked me in the eye. They looked past me, through me, as if I were a piece of furniture that had been awkwardly placed. It was the public execution of my name, my reputation, and no one lifted a finger. I felt a physical tremor start in my chest. A silent, internal reaction to the profound injustice. I was a statue, a frozen frame in a moment of public humiliation. My hands were clenched under the table, but my face remained a blank canvas. I remembered the scent of a military field hospital, the antiseptic, metallic smell of a wound, a memory that reminded me of the true weight of consequence. This was a wound, too. A different kind, but it had the same gravity. After the applause, after the congratulations and the toasts, I stood up and walked away. No words. No goodbyes. Just the quiet, deliberate movement of one foot in front of the other. As I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the echoing laughter from the ballroom followed me out into the humid Connecticut night. The air was thick with the scent of salt and damp earth. I walked to my car, the sodium lights of the parking lot casting a harsh yellow glow. The laughter followed me, an eerie hum in the darkness. It was the sound of a verdict being delivered, a public judgment I had not been allowed to contest. I got into my car and drove, the lingering echo of their laughter a cold, constant companion. I drove through the night, the country club's laughter still echoing in my mind, a persistent, toxic hum. I passed the dark, silent houses of wealthy families I had known my entire life, each one a monument to a trust one had just discovered was a lie. I was an Air Force officer. I had navigated complex international relations, commanded a unit during a combat deployment, and dealt with more paperwork than most people see in a lifetime. My life was built on a foundation of trust and accountability. And in one evening, it had all come crashing down. When I got back to my apartment in Alexandria, The barbershop below was still and dark, a scent of aftershave and hair tonic seeping up through the floorboards. The quiet was louder than any sound. It was a silence I had never known before, the kind that follows a shockwave. My apartment felt hollow. My mission was over, my duty to my family was dissolved, and my personal code had been violated. I stood in the middle of my living room, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I felt the familiar burn behind my eyes, but tears wouldn't come. I had learned a long time ago that tears were a luxury, a release I couldn't afford. Discipline was my armor. It was all I had left. The next day was a Sunday, a day that was always reserved for my routine. I put on my running shoes, the worn-down treads a testament to the miles I had logged along the Potomac. The sun was just rising over the river, casting a pink and gold light on the water. The air was cool and damp. I ran for miles, but I wasn't running for exercise. I was running to put distance between myself and the wreckage of the night before. I was running to feel something other than the crushing silence. My feet hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, a cadence I could control. It was the only thing I could control. When I returned, I didn't sit down. I went straight to my laptop. I pulled up my financial records, the ones I had neglected for years because I had entrusted them to my family. And there it was. The proof. Not a single withdrawal, but a series of them, like a slow-moving, meticulous bleed. There were wire transfers to Alabaster Point LLC, a shell corporation I had never heard of, and a document with a forged signature, a temporary custodial POA I had supposedly signed in 2018. My heart sank. A sense of betrayal so profound it felt like a physical weight in my chest. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a crack in the foundation of my life, a fracture that ran from my past to my present, and it was so much deeper than I had ever imagined. I went to my grandfather's memory care unit. He had been a brilliant man, a quiet presence in my life who had always understood me without words. He sat in his chair, his eyes clear for a moment, then clouding over again. I held his hand, the frail, papery skin a reminder of all that was lost. I had always admired his stoicism, his ability to say more with a glance than most could with 1,000 words. In his presence, the silence was not a burden. It was a comfort. I sat with him for hours, watching the rain fall outside, the familiar, comforting smell of institutional disinfectant a stark contrast to the cloying perfume of my mother's home. I named the personal loss. It wasn't just the money. It was my trust, my identity. The years I had spent building a life of honor and duty, only to have it treated like a prop. They had used my absence, my commitment, my discipline against me. I had lost the family I thought I had, the love I thought was unconditional. It was a realization that cut deeper than any dagger, a silent, internal wound that would take a long time to heal. I made a silent vow. I would not shout. I would not rage. I would not stoop to their level. I would be precise. I would build a case so irrefutable, so airtight, that the truth would speak for itself. I would fight this battle not with emotions, but with facts. Have you ever stood inside this kind of silence, where trust collapses? If you have, you already know what I felt. The hum was no longer a warning, it was a frequency I could now tune. My apartment transformed from a quiet sanctuary into a command center. The kitchen table was no longer for coffee, it was a war board. I didn't have a platoon to lead, but I had a different kind of mission, to assemble an airtight chain of custody for the truth. I began by methodically requesting every document I could get my hands on. My grandfather's will, the Foundation's annual reports, my own DFAS pay stubs, county e-filings, everything was a piece of the puzzle. I was looking for the cracks, the inconsistencies, the things that didn't quite fit. The barbershop's low hum from below and the scent of aftershave became the background music to my quiet investigation. I worked through the nights, surrounded by stacks of paper, the only light coming from my computer screen. The scuff on my boots from my morning ruck felt like a small, comforting weight, an anchor to a world where discipline meant something. The first spark of truth came from an unexpected source. I reached out to Lucas, the family foundation's controller. He had a brittle charm, the kind that promised loyalty, but always felt like it was about to shatter. I'd worked with him briefly years ago, and I remembered his quiet efficiency. He sent me an email, just a single line. I'm out of the company. I couldn't sign the 2024 annual report. Look for the mail server archives. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. The message was a signal, a quiet, almost imperceptible turn of the tide. I sent my JAG attorney, Ari Reyes, calm as a field surgeon, a quick email. She, in turn, found a notarized packet that Lucas had tried to send to a law firm before his departure. He hadn't signed it. It contained a notarized deposition, and it named Evelyn and Sienna as co-conspirators. The real killshot, however, was a fatal small detail. My legal team found a document filed with the state of Connecticut listing me as the temporary custodial POA for the foundation's accounts. The document was dated March 2018. It had my signature, a passable forgery, and what looked like an official stamp. But there was a tiny crucial error. The form listed was Form CT 912, Rev 2020. That version of the form hadn't existed in 2018. It was a digital fingerprint, a silent scream of an impossible timeline. I'd also discovered a microprint ring around the notary seal. That specific printing technology had only been adopted by notary services in the state after the date on the document. My mother and sister had been sloppy, their arrogance leading them to believe no one would ever look that closely. I also received a package from my former commanding officer, Grayson Park. He had tracked down my deployment logs and had a military lawyer put together a detailed chain of custody report showing exactly where I was and what I was doing on the days my signature was forged. The report was a masterpiece of military precision. It didn't accuse anyone of anything, it simply stated facts. I was at Andrews Air Force Base for a full day of briefings, then on a transport plane to Ramstein. I could not have been in Connecticut to sign a legal document. The evidence was irrefutable. At the Foundation's annual audit review, an open session by policy, I stood up. The room was packed with the same faces that had laughed at me at the country club. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make an accusation. I just walked to the screen, plugged in my laptop, and hit a key. A split-screen overlay appeared. On one side was my real signature, pulled from a bank document. On the other was the forged vector path from the POA. The differences were subtle, but undeniable to any forensic accountant. Then came the wire routes, a labyrinth of transfers from the Foundation's accounts, through the shell company Alabaster Point LLC, and directly into the lease payments for Sienna's high-end design studio in Soho. Finally, a single email appeared on the screen, dated the same day as the forged document. The subject line was POA for Maddox Vale Foundation. The body contained a single sentence: "She's deployed. I am her proxy, EV." The IP address traced back to my mother's home. The moderator, a man who had known my family for decades, cleared his throat, his face pale. He looked at me, then at Evelyn and Sienna, who sat stone-faced, staring at the screen. He asked for my comment. I looked him dead in the eye, and the only words I said were a quiet, controlled order. Document everything. And then I yielded the floor, letting the auditors and timestamps and the cold, hard facts do the talking for me. I didn't take the call from my mother, or the frantic, tearful text from Sienna. I simply let the information I'd presented at the audit review do its work. The quiet hum had transformed. It was no longer the sound of a gathering storm or a lie about to crack. It was the sound of a new, stable frequency. A sense of peace, the quiet thrum of a machine that was running exactly as it should. I changed my phone number, archived the family chat, and dropped the house keys for their brownstone in the mail. My withdrawal was not a surrender, it was a strategic repositioning. I had no desire to burn down what remained. I only wanted to rebuild, and I needed to do it on my own terms. The scent of hot towels and barbershop disinfectant from below my apartment became a comforting anchor to my new, unburdened life. I established new boundaries and routines, a conscious rebuilding of a life I had ceded control of for too long. My pre-dawn rucks by the Potomac became a sacred ritual. The cool, damp air and the rising sun were a daily reminder that new beginnings were always possible. I wasn't just running for fitness, I was running to put distance between my past and my future. I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started focusing on what I could build. My personal mission, once confined to military duty, expanded. I began to write 8 lines of code every day, a disciplined, purposeful habit. I was building Gaiden, an open-source tool for service member financial guardianship audits. I wanted to create a tool that would prevent what had happened to me from happening to anyone else. It was a project born of pain, but fueled by purpose. My chosen alliances became my new family. I spent my Sundays with my JAG attorney, Ari Reyes, at a quiet coffee shop in Old Town Alexandria. We didn't talk about my case. We talked about her 2 kids and her aspirations to open her own practice. She had a warm steel about her, a strength that was quiet and unwavering. We launched the Quiet Ledger Network, a collective of volunteer JAG attorneys and reservist CPAs to offer pro bono services to military families. The name was a nod to my belief that true power was found in documentation, not declarations. I also began to work with my former CO, Grayson Park. He had been a silent ally, providing me with the tools I needed to fight my war without firing a shot. Together, we found the old blueprints and technical notes from my grandfather's foundation work, the designs he had used to build clean water systems in developing nations decades ago. My grandfather's notes were a revelation, a quiet legacy I had never known about. With the support of the Quiet Ledger Network, we began to adapt them into open-source specifications for low-cost water units that could be installed at VA clinics. The work was simple, but the impact was profound. We were building, not just for ourselves, but for others. The frost that had once crept into my life had melted away, leaving a sense of clarity and purpose. The public humiliation, the betrayal, it all felt like something that had happened to a different person in a different life. I found myself with a half smile on my face more often, one that was not for anyone else, but for myself. It was a small, private victory. My shoulders were set, my gaze steady. The disciplined rebuilding had changed me. I was no longer an outsider in my own life. I was the architect of my own future. My existence was no longer defined by the hum of someone else's lies. It was defined by the steady, purposeful rhythm of my own truth. The natural consequences of their actions were not a result of my anger, but of their own deceit. The truth, once released, was an unstoppable force. The Attorney General's office, in a matter of weeks, had launched its own inquiry. Evelyn and Sienna were not facing criminal charges because I had not pressed them. I wanted quiet liberation, not public spectacle. Instead, there was a consent decree, a legally binding agreement for them to repay every cent of the stolen funds into a restitution fund. Sienna was forced to shut down her design studio, and Evelyn was quietly removed from the foundation board. Their names were not in the headlines. There was no public statement from me. Just a quiet, lasting echo of the truth that had been unveiled in that audit meeting. The hum was gone completely now. The public shame was a silence, a private truth they now lived with, just as I had lived with their lies. I find my peace in ordinary things. My Sundays are still for my grandfather, but now they are a different kind of visit. I took him from the sterile, cloying air of the memory care unit and brought him to a small, private home near the Potomac. The windows look out onto a small garden, and the scent of freshly cut grass now replaces the antiseptic odor of the institution. He smiles more now. He remembers the small details. His notes on the water units, his quiet pride. It's enough. I think back to that courtroom, that humid, lemon-scented room where they tried to define me. I am the same woman, but with a sharper axis. I have found acceptance without access, a kind of forgiveness at a distance, and a resilience that is now as routine as my morning run. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their love. I just needed the truth, and I found it. Today, I was at a public school gym in Anacostia, the air filled with the scent of old wood and worn leather. I was teaching land navigation to a JROTC class. A young girl, maybe 16, was struggling with her compass. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, and she looked up at me, frustrated. I knelt down beside her, the hard gym floor a familiar feeling beneath my knees. Just point it north, I said quietly. Don't overthink it. She lined up the compass needle, her hand shaking slightly, then held it steady. The arrow settled, pointing to a single, ordinary direction. North. It was enough. The girl smiled, a small, genuine smile. Her face was not a mask of practiced grace or brittle charm. It was just a face, a human face that had found its way. My revenge was not in their downfall. It was in my own rebuilding. My justice was not in their punishment, but in my quiet, dignified return. The ash that I had once been was now a foundation, a fertile ground for new growth. I had walked through fire and had not burned. Some battles end when you decline to fire. Evidence does the talking. Time writes the after-action report. The frost has thawed. The cracks have mended. I am whole again. Not the woman I was, but the woman I was meant to be. The quiet hum I feel now is the sound of my own truth, a constant, steady frequency that is strong enough to stand on its own. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.